Welcome everybody to day 2 of the October Start virtual orientation sessions. Before we get started, let's review a few important housekeeping notes. During today's session, please remain muted with your camera off for the duration. If you experience any technical difficulties during today's session, you can send a chat to Anne-Marie Ashford. Chat will open publicly during designated periods throughout today's presentation, and we will indicate those periods to you and welcome you to use chat. As you're listening to Dave's presentation today, please feel free to send your questions to the host as they arise using the chat. We will hold on to them and we will address them during the Q&A session beginning at 2 p.m. Eastern. Closed captioning is available. To activate, please look for the CC transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'd like to now go over a brief overview of today's schedule. From 1 to 2 Eastern, 10 to 11 Pacific, we will have Dave Hingsburger doing a talk on sexual identity. We will then transition into a Q&A with Dave and Jill. And this is the forum where we will be able to address your questions. So just a reminder, if you have questions as Dave is talking, please send them to us in the chat. We'll then have a 30-minute break from 3 p.m. Eastern to 3:30. And then when we return at 3:30 Eastern, 12:30 Pacific, we will have a panel discussion featuring Rami Jadri, Micah Peace, Connie Sr., moderated by Dr. Jill Hinton and Dave Hingsburger as the respondent. I'd like to now introduce today's presenter, Dave Hingsburger, and Dr. Jill Hinton, who will be moderating both the Q&A and the panel discussion. Dave is the Director of Clinical and Educational Supports for Vita Community Living Services. He has worked in service to people with disabilities for over 40 years. Dave has given lectures at an international level and has published over 30 books and nearly 100 papers. His work has been called groundbreaking and innovative. He has been inducted into the Canadian Disability Hall of Fame and won the Inspire Lifetime Achievement Award given out by the LGBT community in Toronto. So glad to have you, Dave. Dr. Jill Hinton is a clinical psychologist with over 30 years of experience working with people with intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, and mental illness. As the clinical director of the Center for START Services, Dr. Hinton provides education and training to START teams across the country and facilitates a monthly practice group for START program clinical directors. She currently serves as project manager for New York START and California START. Areas of particular interest include autism spectrum disorders and trauma and grief in people with IDD. Welcome, Dr. Hinton. I'm going to Dave, so glad to have you.
Thank you. When I was first asked to do this presentation on issues regarding the LGBT community, particularly as it intersects with the disability community, I was very excited about that because I am a member of both the disability community and the LGBT community. And it was something that I very much wanted to speak towards. Now, I've been working in the area of sexuality and intellectual disabilities for over 30 years. And I'm going to take you back because I want to put a framework around how we think about difference. So I want to take you back to when the clinic first began, which was maybe 30 years ago. And when we began, we were working in the area of sexuality and disability. And back in those days, that in and of itself was controversial, not even considering sexual diversity. The idea of people with disabilities simply being sexual was something that was very radical, and people were very concerned about the work we were doing. When the government discovered what we were doing, they were very, very clear. They gave us boundaries that we could work, geographical boundaries that we could work in, and then they demanded that we have an advisory committee from people from a variety of different service agencies and people from the community and people from the church and so forth. So it was overseen by a group of people who were scared all the time, just because most of what we were doing was new, because there was other treatment clinics, but they were all in jails and so forth. And here we were going to be working with sexuality in the community. About 2 years in, we're doing fairly well. And a fellow that I've been working with on my caseload came forward to me, and he had an unusual question. He said that what he wanted to do was he wanted to speak to somebody gay who wasn't within the system. So he didn't want to talk to me because he was afraid that my allegiance was to the system and not to him. And I think that that's an interesting thing to hear, that people with disabilities understand that allegiances aren't necessarily in their best interest, aren't necessarily person-centered, aren't necessarily welcoming to difference. So he wanted to speak to a gay peer counselor, but from outside the sector. Well, I took that to the advisory committee, and they were very nervous about that. They were very nervous about the request. And they talked about it for a long time, particularly because they said we didn't want to lead people with disabilities down the garden path to homosexuality. And I believe that's the only way you get there. But nonetheless, they didn't want that to be the case. However, finally, it was realized this was his request, an independent request that he brought forward, and that we should honor that. So I was asked to search for somebody, and I found somebody at the local gay church, somebody who did counseling and did therapy and did peer work. So I spent some time with this fellow on the phone saying, we have a person with disability, he wants to come in and speak to you, and I don't know what his questions are. I can't prepare you because he won't tell me. He won't tell me because he doesn't trust my allegiance. So he won't tell me. He wants to speak to you. We all agreed that that's what would happen. So when the peer counselor came in, they went into an office, and I introduced the two of them and then closed the door. And I have to tell you, my heart was going crazy because I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know what questions were going to be asked. But I have to tell you, the questions that I had in my head that I thought he was asking were completely wrong. I thought he was going to be in there asking questions about sexuality, questions about disease and disease transmission, and all these kinds of things that he would have got from a regular sex education class somewhere. But when it was over, the person with disability came out and he thanked me for allowing this to happen. And it's really sad that the word allow has to even be in that sentence. But I asked him if it would be okay for me to talk to the peer counselor about what was said. He said, yeah, I'm fine. You can talk to him. He can tell you what we talked about. So I went in, I sat down, and I looked at the gay peer counselor, and he was wiping his eyes. And I'm like, what happened in here? What happened in here? And he said, well, he had only one question. And we spent all of our time talking about that one question. And that one question was, could two men love each other? Now, he knew that two men could have sex together. He'd had sex with men before, but it was always hidden away. It was always frantic. It was always afraid of being caught. It was always tinged with danger. But he wasn't interested in the sex stuff. He wanted to know whether or not two men could form a bond, could fall in love with one another, could form a relationship. This is what he wanted to talk about. And I have to tell you, that took me such by surprise. But when it came down to it, he wanted to talk about the heart. He wanted to talk about love. And in doing so, he was making himself incredibly vulnerable. And the gay peer counselor said something to me that I'll always remember. He said, I felt like I was standing on his sacred ground. And I think that that's something we need to think about when people come to us and when we learn things about people and our reaction to them. I don't know that we govern ourselves particularly well, and I don't know whether or not we think about our reaction and how it comes across to somebody with a disability and so forth, and forget that we're in positions of power. But we're standing on sacred ground when we get to the area of sexuality and identity and gender and all of those things that make people feel very vulnerable. And that's not what I see and hear when I'm actually out doing work on the area of sexuality. I'll be meeting with teams of people, and they're always frantic teams, and they're always really concerned, and they're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, we have somebody that we're serving that's gay. Oh my God, 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 we're serving somebody who's transgender. Oh my God, I'm losing my mind. I mean, it's like people completely lose perspective. They lose perspective. And I think it's because we're in this confined system. And this confined system has a serious set of beliefs about control, about controlling other people, controlling how they love, controlling how they identify, controlling everything. Because our opinion matters so much in the lives of people with disabilities. And that's probably one of the biggest problems, is that our opinions matter at all. I don't even understand. I'll be sitting at a table and somebody will bring their opinion forward, an opinion about masturbation or an opinion about homosexuality or about being transgendered or opinion about it. I don't want to hear your opinion. Your opinion doesn't matter. And the fact that you think it does and the fact that you bring it to a table tells me that there are boundary issues happening here, that you're just not able to separate yourself from the other individual. And you need to somehow bring you and your opinion to a table, a professional table, to talk about the life of another person. And you see this in really, really bizarre ways. We got a referral from an agency, and they were very, very concerned. And they let us know on the phone that they were very, very concerned because one of the men in their home, they discovered, had some women's clothing. And he would occasionally get dressed up in his room. Now, this guy wasn't parading around the house. I think he was way too smart for that. I think he knew exactly what would happen to him if he did. So he did it in his room, making the mistake that his room was his, that it belonged to him, that he could do what he wanted in there. But that's not true. I mean, the rooms of people with disabilities are open to inspection, where people can go in and look. And people went in and looked, and I don't even understand why they went in and looked, but they discovered these dresses that he had brought with him from his last move. And he had them hidden away, and he would close the door every now and then and put them on, and the staff had discovered the dresses, and they discovered him wearing them, and they wanted it to stop right now. So we went out to do an introductory meeting about what the clinic does, and the sexuality clinic does, and so forth. And my boss, Susan, who's since passed away, she was a lovely woman, and I love telling this story because I get to remember her. We were driving there, and we were both trying to think about how are we going to tell them that this isn't a problem? How are we going to tell them that the problem that they had was not the person in the room, but their reaction and what they were doing and their desire to punish and their desire to scold and their desire to steal, and it's theft, taking from people with disabilities. So we arrive in the house. Now, this is going to be very hard to believe, but I promise you it's true. We arrive and we park, and the door opens to the group home, in which we were about to enter, and out comes a man with an intellectual disability. He's about 35 years old. He gets to the front of the yard, undoes his zipper, pulls out his penis, and takes a pee. He's peeing in a neighborhood, and we were like, forgive me, but we were like, that's awesome. We could go in and say, we don't believe the person who's wearing a dress needs any service, but this guy exposing his penis in public in a neighborhood, that's a concern. So we went in and sat down, and we had this as our strategy. And Susan started, and she started to talk about what we had seen and explained to them what we saw, because we figured they must not know. They must not know. And they said, oh, yeah, he does that all the time. What? This guy is exposing himself on a regular basis out in front of your house, and you're not concerned about it? And they were saying, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the guy upstairs wearing dresses. And we were astonished that they had right in front of them a really serious problem with boundaries and with exposure and something that could be considered a sexual crime. And they had no concern about it because they were worried about those damn dresses. So the work we began was very clearly to change the attitude of the staff. And in fact, we couldn't. And in fact, they were entrenched that if he was going to be in that house, there was no way that he was going to have those dresses. So we had to facilitate a move for him out of that system, because sometimes we leave people in systems that hurt them and or walk away saying, well, I tried. Well, you know that somebody behind you is going to be hurt continuously over a long period of time. So we facilitated his move out of there, and they never did refer the person who peed on the lawn, who was arrested about 6 months later. It's just inconceivable how people respond to things that they think are different. And let me say this, I'm using the word different. However, other people are using the words like deviant and perverse or perverted, or those kinds of words, those damning words, when it's simply a difference here that we're talking about. You know, that reminds me also of a group home that called us because this fellow was wearing women's pantyhose, and we why is that a problem? Well, you know, when he's in the house and he's walking around, we can see the pantyhose out of his jeans. And so our solution was, we wrote this whole report and said that our main recommendation is make him wear socks. You know, and then you have no idea, like you don't know right now whether or not I've got pantyhose on, but because I've got socks on, you don't know that, and that's probably good. But anyways, people kept referring people to us because they wanted clinical intervention to stop this. Now, you have to understand something. When it comes to behavior therapy, when it comes to working with people with disabilities, behavior therapy has a lot to apologize for, and particularly in the area of sexuality. I mean, you only have to go back about 15 years in the literature to find people using contingent electric shock and contingent lemon juice shot in the mouth and contingent this and contingent that for masturbation. For masturbation. We went wild with our power in the area of sexuality, and we hurt so many people. So we were determined that we were going to be sexuality positive and that we were going to be welcoming to people with disabilities. And the community agencies were really frustrated because they wanted us to come in and stop people rather than come in to help people. to express themselves in healthy ways and so forth. But we have to think about what happens to people with disabilities when systems are homophobic. Let me tell you about a guy who I learned a lot from. His name is Mark, and he knows I tell this story. Um, Mark was an interesting man to work with. He had been caught engaging in sexual behavior in the bushes at Fairy Lake Park in Newmarket, and I had to say, that's not what the sign means. And if you don't believe me, Fairy Lake Park, look at the map. So as I worked with him, and as I sort of delved into his history, which is something that I wanted to do, maybe 6 or 7 months in, he lets out a secret. And that is, he had a boyfriend that he was in love with, and he's still in love with. And I asked his boyfriend's name, and he wouldn't tell me. He wouldn't tell me. And you know why? He decided that he trusted me, but he didn't think he could make that decision for another person. He still wasn't sure who I was and what my connections were and what I could do to someone else. But eventually he told me, and he was still living in the institution because it had not closed yet at that time. And we began to work towards getting them together. But I wanted to hear his story because I think that the stories that people tell us give us an insight into what their experiences are. So he said that he and his boyfriend, when they lived together in the institution, they secreted themselves away. They went to hidden places where they could engage in sexual behavior, hidden places where they could just be together. And eventually, somebody described the relationship. He said that he and his boyfriend were in a stairwell. They were engaged in sexual behavior. Staff came in, pounced upon them, grabbed him, grabbed his boyfriend. He was yanked into a timeout room, and his boyfriend was yanked somewhere, and he doesn't know where because he never saw him again. He never saw him again. And here's what he said to me. Love is wrong because people hurt you for it. So he had become afraid to love within this system that's supposed to be supporting him as a whole human being. He's saying, I'm afraid to love because you people hurt me. And I'm tired of you people hurting me. Well, we did manage to get a hold of his boyfriend. We did manage to speak to some people who had some power. And we did manage to set up them getting back together again and visiting one another and seeing one another on a regular basis. Now, that relationship did not last. Now, I don't think, the reason I think it didn't last was simply because they hadn't seen each other for a very long time. And on top of that, they were only allowed to see each other 3 or 4 times in the year. So it just sort of faded away. But nonetheless, he had a chance to reconnect. And we did what we could to make that happen. But I wanted to make it clear to the organization that served him that this is a man who's grieving. He's grieving the loss of his ability to love, to be able to love freely, to be able to love openly, to be able to love in a way that he is comfortable with. So when systems are homophobic, they hurt people. They hurt people. And it's not just people with disabilities who get hurt. There was a lesbian woman who was actually a friend of mine who came to me and told me a story and said that she wanted to let me know that it was an awful story and she needed forgiveness in some kind of way. But she worked in a day program. And in that day program, people were very, very hostile to the idea of gay relationships and so forth. Because remember, this was a few years ago. I think it's still true a lot in service systems all over North America, but here it was a few years ago. And she was working in one of the areas of the day program, and one of the women that she provided support to got a crush on her and essentially came out to her, and not only as a lesbian woman, but came out to her and said, "I think I love you." Now, you have to understand the situation that this lesbian staff was in, because she knew if people found out that she was lesbian, firstly, the likelihood she'd lose her job was very high. And secondly, in relationship to this woman, she was afraid that she was going to be considered a predator, and that she needed to very much make it clear that she's not. So she came down so hard on this poor woman who had come forward to speak her truth, to tell her truth, to confess her affections. She came down on her so hard, telling her that what she was thinking and feeling was dirty and wrong, and she never wanted to hear it again. And, you know, we talked about it for a long time, and she had all sorts of reasons for doing what she did, but in the end, 3 or 4 days later, she quit her job. She said, "I simply can't do this anymore. I can't hide in plain sight. I simply can't allow myself to be hurting other people." So when the system is homophobic, it hurts people. It hurts the staff, and it hurts people with disabilities. And when the system is transphobic, the same thing occurs. We had a situation at Vita where it was funny, because with my job working in clinical services, anything in the agency that had anything to do with sexuality in any kind of way, even if it had nothing to do with clinical services and more operational services, it landed on my desk. It just landed. Take it today. Take it today. He's the resident gay. Take it to him. So we had a situation again, it was a workshop where somebody came forward, a staff came forward and said that they were transgender, and that they no longer wanted to be called by the name of their birth, that they had another name they wished to be called. And there was this request on my desk saying, "We got to get in there. We got to get in there. We got to do trainings. People are all upset. We need to do training." And I'm like, "No, we don't. No, we don't. Training is completely unnecessary here. Completely unnecessary. Because all we need to do is say to the staff, call him by his name. He's told you the name, call him by his name. No more than that. No discussion, no training." Because there's this idea that somehow we need to train people regarding some of this. And I think some of that's crap. Because I'll tell you, people know already that it's wrong. I mean, if you remember the show Glee, there was in the television program, for those of you who didn't see it, there were some out gay kids, and the other students in the school would get slushies that were full of ice and throw them at the LGBT kids in the school. And it was part of the drama and demonstrating bullying and all that. However, I don't know if you know, it took off as a social phenomenon. And it took off even in Toronto. We were getting reports on the news of these gangs of teenagers coming down into the center of the city, to the gay community and the gay neighborhood, and walking along, and anybody they thought was somewhat different in any kind of way, they threw slushies in their face. And people were getting hurt because there's ice in there, and people's eyes were getting damaged and so forth because it was thrown with such force. And I was watching the television, and they were interviewing somebody from the LGBT community saying, "You know, I think what we need to do is some training." Training? I was screaming at the television screen. You don't have to train people. Good heavens, what teenager doesn't know that you don't throw slushies in the face of strangers? I mean, what teenager doesn't know that? You know, what information are you going to give them? And just the mere idea that we have to do education regarding this in this particular situation is because we're sort of saying, well, you know, I understand why you threw slushies in their face because you haven't had training and you haven't learned that they're a human being and you haven't learned. No, 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 that gives everybody an excuse. So why did you beat the shit out of that transgendered person? Well, um, I haven't had training. I mean, that doesn't even make sense, but somehow we think that's the answer. Sometimes we just simply need to say, no, do this. And that's what we did. We said it as an organization, we said it as a senior team, and we gave that direction to the staff with no opportunity for discussion because we didn't care. You know, like, this request has been made of us. It's a reasonable request by one of our valued staff, and we were going to just simply do that. Could you imagine how that staff must have felt or would have felt if they knew that when they left work on a Wednesday afternoon, the whole staff was getting together to be trained about how to be in the room with somebody like her, or sorry, somebody like him. I misgendered there. No, but here's the interesting thing. Once we did that, and once we made that message clear, and once people began to hear it throughout the organization, all of a sudden, we had transgendered folks within the organization coming forward for the very first time. And I think it's because they saw that maybe it was safe here. Maybe it's not safe anywhere else, but maybe it's safe here. And that was so gratifying to us that people began to feel safe. I mean, we run service for adults, so we need to make sure that adults feel welcome. And the part of adulthood that we don't really like is sexuality and sexual identity and gender stuff. You know, we're not so fond of that. But here in this situation, we had people coming forward. And I think it's important to note that, because I hear people say things like, we don't have that problem here. We don't have that problem here. Well, that's why. That's why, because you see it as a problem. You see it as a problem. We don't have that problem here. We don't have that problem here. And I want you to know, if you work in an environment where nobody is out of in any kind of way, that's because they're terrified of you. That's because they're terrified of you. We are everywhere. We are everywhere, but we're not welcome everywhere. And it's very clear where we're not welcome. And we're not welcomed in particular groups of people. We're not welcome with particular groups of staff. We're not welcome in particular places in society. We're certainly not welcome to hold hands when walking down the street. We're certainly not welcome. And I hear people who say things, well, I'm just worried that he's a situational homosexual. He was institutionalized and that's all he knew. Or I'm just worried she doesn't understand what gender means. I mean, why would she want to be a man? Do you know, that's prejudice wrapped up in concern. And we're really good at that. We're really good at hiding our prejudices and hiding our biases under being so caring and so forth. But it's not. It's not. It's just simply prejudice. And prejudice needs to be confronted in a variety of different ways. Now, I want to tell you something that I did, and I want you to know it was wrong, and I want you to know that I did get punished for it. But nonetheless, let me tell you the story, and I want to tell you the whole story. So we get a referral from somebody who is living in an institution on a sex offender ward. Now, we run a clinic on the area of sexuality, and we do serve people who are sex offenders. So this person,
Dave, this is Beth. I'm sorry to interrupt you. When you lean to the side, we lose audio.
Okay, sorry, let me move. So how do I need to go back to the beginning?
Nope, this is perfect.
Okay, all righty. Sorry about that. So he was in a treatment environment in the institution, and he was going to be moving to the community, and the community that he was going to be moving to was our community. Now, I went at a meeting to a meeting to meet this fellow, to meet the group home supervisor that's considering taking him, and to meet all the various people. So when I meet with him, which I do before the larger meeting, because I want to get a sense of his story, because as I said, I think stories matter. This is a guy who's had a life of just violence. He was taken into care when he was very young, and when he was 16 years old, he was living in a group home and he had a staff that he really trusted. He was really close to this staff. So he came out to the staff because he felt that he was safe with the staff, and the staff had a very bad reaction. As a matter of fact, the staff beat him up to the point that he was hospitalized from that. Now, the staff was let go, but that doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's important, and we need to do that kind of thing. But to the person who's been beaten up, that doesn't mean a whole lot. I'm injured. I'm in the hospital. I trusted somebody. I put my heart in my hands and I gave it to somebody, and they stomped all over it. So he was then moved from there to an organization that was, and I'm not putting down anything here. You understand it can happen in any organization, but this just happened to be a Christian organization. And he moved in there, them knowing his history, and again, them knowing his history. Now, in the group home, there was another fellow with a disability, and the two of them started hanging around together. And eventually, they fell in love with each other. Now, love stories for people with disabilities are often very brutal. So it was discovered, and then it was reported, and his partner's parents were informed. Now, he had no one on his side. He had no one to speak for him. So the parents of the other person were so angry that they wanted a guarantee that the man who had sex with and who had fallen in love with their son be sent for an offender's treatment, because he must be a rapist. My son would never have consented. My son would never do that kind of thing. My son would never. And what their son did was simply cry all the time. He just cried all the time. And they thought he was crying because he'd been abused. Well, he was crying because he was abused. They were abusing him. They were abusing him. They were breaking up a relationship that he had. They were in love with each other, for heaven's sake. So the fellow that eventually I was going to be working with was then put in a treatment facility for rapists with intellectual disabilities. This guy has never hurt anybody. And he undergoes the treatment. And even though the treatment personnel understand what his story is, they still say, well, we don't really know. We don't really know about consent. Oh, we don't really know? What do you mean? He said he consented. The other fellow said he consented. With anybody else, that's fine. But with people with disabilities, when they do something that we don't agree with, they don't understand. They did something wrong. So they put him through this treatment. God knows what that would have done to him. And now he's looking at moving back into the community. So we go into the meeting together, and I'm a little bit traumatized just from having heard his story. And we sit around and we talk, and there's a representative, as I said, from the group home, and he was allowed to ask any questions at all. So he turned to the supervisor of the group home and said, "Are your staff allowed to hit people? Are your staff allowed to hurt people? Will I be safe there?" Now, these are really good questions, and they were direct and they were blunt. And the supervisor absolutely promised him that he would be safe in that environment. Then he turned to me and he said, "So I'm going to have to see you. You're my therapist." And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Well, can you make me like women?" And I was like, "Well, why would you want me to do that?" And he said, "Because I want to stop people hurting me. I want to stop people from calling me names. I don't want to like men anymore. I want to like women, because then people will leave me alone." And I said, "Okay, how about this? How about we work at stopping the hurt, stopping the name calling? How about we do that for a while, and let's see how you feel later?" And he said that would be fine. All right, now let's be clear. The guy, the supervisor, who was taking him into the group home that he operated, was there at the meeting, knew his history, knew he was taking somebody in who self-identified as being a member of the LGBT community. Self-identified, no question at all. So he takes him there. Now I go and see him at the day program that he goes to. And we typically in the summertime actually go out and sit at a picnic table that they have just outside the building, because we could be much more private there, even though we're in a very public setting. And we weren't really beginning treatment at this point, because I was just getting to know him. And I understood that the biggest part of my job right now was getting him to understand that he could trust me. And that was rapport building, and that's what I was doing. So I was only about 3 weeks into this when I arrived to pick him up and take him out to the picnic table. And he got to the picnic table. I knew something was very wrong, very wrong. And I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "No, I'm not." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Why didn't you tell me God hated me? Why didn't you tell me I was going to go to hell? Why didn't you tell me that? You told me that it's okay. Why didn't you tell me?" Okay, pause. "Where did you hear this?" He said the supervisor had taken him for a drive the night before and had a talk with him and talked to him about God and about his faith and Christianity, and talked to him about all those things, but gave the message very clearly that gay people aren't welcome in him and gay people are going to burn in hell. Now you have to understand, I'm really angry. I am really, really angry. And that was my excuse when I explained all of this to my boss. I was really angry. I was angry because, this guy wasn't forced upon them. He chose him to be in the group home, and he already knew who he was. I mean, he already knew. What was his plan? Was he sitting there thinking, "I'll get him in my home and I'll convert him, I'll pray for him, and we'll change him"? Is that what his plan was? Do you bring somebody into a home with this idea that who they are is fundamentally wrong and that they need to be fixed, and they need to be fixed by you, and they need to be fixed by your God? I mean, is this who you bring into your home? And talk about the level of dishonesty. if that's what you're going to do, say it. Say it. You know, why are you doing it under the cover of darkness? Why are you doing it on a drive in a car? I mean, why are you doing it in such a way that communicates this was your plan all along? Well, I was very, very angry. Now, he was the person who I saw last at the end of the day. So I got in my car and I drove home. And by the time I got home, I was ready. I was ready to make a phone call to the group home. So I called the group home and I asked for the supervisor. And you know what? God was on my side because the supervisor was out. And I realized that I still wasn't settled enough yet. So I wait about another 20 minutes and I call. And I could tell just by the way my voice was vibrating that I was still really, really upset. Now, I wasn't upset what he did to me, but I was upset that the situation that he put this man in. You know, I'm really, really worried that this man is so frightened of his own gayness that he's going to go out and rape a woman just to prove to everybody that, like, I mean, talk about taking a situation and turning it wrong in every possible way. And the supervisor was there. So I said to the supervisor that I had heard about the conversation that he had had the night before. And he said, well, you know, I was just sharing my views and sharing my opinion. And I think that that's important that we do because I need to be genuine with him. Seriously? And that's what you want me to believe? I said, you know something? If you remember, we made a decision. And here's the decision that we made. When he was going to be moving into the community, we were a little concerned about his transition for one particular reason. And that was that he was in a treatment facility for sex offenders. So let me tell you, sex was widely available to him. And whenever they tried to stop him from doing that, he would insert things and dangerous things in his anus. And so what we decided to do, since he was going to be moving and that he wasn't probably going to be in a relationship yet or have that need fulfilled, that we would simply buy him a dildo that he could use during that period of time. And it was very funny. The first time I mentioned that, we were sitting at a table with all the staff in the group home, and there was a woman sitting next to me, and she wrote down dildo as if it was herbed bread, dildo. And I'm like, no, that's not what it is. So I said, you remember we decided that? And he said, yes. And I said, well, you know what? We haven't bought the dildo yet. So here's what we're going to do. You are going to buy the dildo. And it's coming out of your petty cash, and I'll accompany you, but you're going to buy the dildo. He said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I said, I could call someone to tell them what you did and get permission for you to do this. He said, please don't. And I said, well, then come shopping with me. So there was a store which was called Lovecraft in the city of Toronto. And we went into Lovecraft, and I'd been there before, always on professional calls, of course. So we go in, and he is mortified, just mortified of being in there, completely embarrassed. His face was so red. And me, I was having fun, okay? I was picking up these giant dildos, like almost like baseball bats, and say, what do you think of this one? What do you think of this one? Well, eventually we bought this really large dildo. And I said, okay, here's what we're going to do next. There's a coffee shop right across the street. So we'll go over there and we'll sit down and talk, because not only have you bought it, you're going to teach him how to use it. And he said, no, I can't do that. Please don't make me do that. I don't want to do that. And I said, I could call someone and I could get you permission. No. So we go over and we go into this coffee shop, which was full of people. And I pulled the dildo out of the bag, and it just laying there on the table, right in front of two of us. And I picked it up and I began to talk about the use of dildos and how to make use of dildos safe and all that stuff. And he's there, his face is almost blistered because it was so hot. And then I put the dildo away. And I said, "So how did that feel?" He said, "What do you mean? How did it feel to have somebody who had power over you make you do something that is so fundamentally against your character? How did you feel with that?" He said, "Well, I hated it." And I said, I think you need to think about what you just did, because what I did to you is nowhere near what you did to this guy who's in your care, who is vulnerable to you, vulnerable to you." I got in a lot of trouble for that. But you know what? I'm okay with that. Occasionally, I don't mind people being really, really angry with me. So I want to tell you one last situation. We had a woman who was a trans woman. She went through some surgeries, and and on hormones and stuff like that, and was being supported by the organization. And then she began to date someone in the organization who everybody saw as a typical man. Now, this man had no difficulty being a man or being identified as a man, but he also identified as heterosexual. But he was in this relationship with this trans woman, which you have to understand is essentially a heterosexual relationship. But people were just, "Oh, she's using him, she's tricking him, she's deluding him." Because you see, he was a really popular guy within the agency. And everybody was very, very concerned, very, very concerned about this relationship. And he was really clear. He loved her. He loved her. And they had figured out how that love would work. They had figured out how they could have time together. They had figured out how they were having sex together. They had figured it all out. But people around them formed this sort of like a ring of gossip and a ring of concern. And again, we're called in because she's exploiting him. He has a right. Hold on here. Hold on here. This relationship, even with all the opposition that they're getting on both sides, this relationship is continuing. Do you understand that? Do you understand the commitment that that makes? That these people are standing up to you, that their love gives them the strength to stand up to you, to withstand the absolute assault on them as a couple and as individuals, the absolute assault on them, and say, "No, we're in love with each other. No, this is our relationship. No." Then, of course, we have family who get involved. And there's all sorts of discussion with the family and all sorts of upset with the family. But you should have seen this couple. They had gone through fire already. They had gone through the worst of staff prejudice. They had gone through the worst of what it is to live in the system and not be free. Because that's the biggest problem here, isn't it? That, I'm gay, but I'm free. I don't live in a system. And I don't have my parents determining whether or not I should be allowed to have sex with my husband. I don't have that. I live in a world that's free. But people with disabilities aren't free. And let's not pretend that they are over any aspect of their lives. People with disabilities are in a system. Now, the system can be captive, hold them captive, or the system can work towards their freedom, but those are the only two choices. So the parents get involved and so forth. Now, like I said, they've been through fire, and they withstood parents. Now, one of the things that you need to understand about Canada is that guardianship in Canada almost universally is in the hands of people with disabilities. There are, in our agency, I think there may be, out of several hundred people, maybe 2 or 3 people who have parental guardianship, and that's in a very limited thing over medical or finance or something like that, but not over relationships, because we in Canada don't believe that that's okay. So they withstood that. And you know, one of the nicest moments in all of my work was the Saturday afternoon watching them get married. Watching them get married, watching them fulfill their life's dreams. He wanted to have a woman fall in love with him. She wanted to be a woman who fell in love with a man, and both got everything that they wanted, but they had to withstand such fire. But here's the thing that makes me worried, and here's the thing that makes me sad. I think most people with disabilities are so bowed by the system and so bowed into compliance that they may never speak to you about who they are. So it's our job. And when I work with people with disabilities, I figure my first job is to teach them that they are safe with me and safe from me. That's my first job. And I really wish it was the first job of every staff who worked with a person with disability anywhere in the world. Just make it understood that they're safe with and they're safe from me. And once I can do that and watch people grow and develop. But I'm so worried that so many people with disabilities are so afraid of what's going to happen if they tell the truth, that they simply tell a lie. You know, people say to me, one of my problems with people with disabilities is they just say what they think we want to hear. They just say what they think we want to hear. And I hear that over and over about people with disabilities. Oh, they just give me the answer that they think I want to hear. Well, have you ever stopped to think about that? I mean, serious, have you ever just stopped to think about it? Because what we do is we're putting on people with disabilities this thing that somehow that they're just wanting to please us, and somehow they're just not telling us the truth, and somehow they're maybe fundamentally dishonest, or whatever those things are. But you understand, the reason they tell you what you want to hear is because they're afraid of you. I mean, what kind of world must people with disabilities live in if when they're asked a question, their first panicked response is, oh my God, what do they want from me? I better give them what I want, because if I don't give them what I want, I'm not going to have a good day, I'm not going to have a good month, and I'm not going to have a good life. So if we start to think of what we need to be doing at the very beginning of this, is protecting people with disabilities from our own power, not the whole system, but from our own power. We don't control the system, but we control our power, and we control our interactions with people. And I really hope people come to the point where they realize that the biggest boundary that you can understand is, this is me and this is you. And I want you to respect me as me, but I need to respect you as well. Because people with disabilities almost routinely have their sense of who they are judged or condemned or found wrong. And maybe that's where we need to start. And maybe that's how we can begin to apologize to people with disabilities for our history of serving them so poorly in an area that's so important in their lives. Remember what he wanted. He wanted love. And remember what people wanted. They want to feel comfortable in their bodies. These are things that should be simply given for people with disabilities. So maybe it's time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. We're going to transition now into the Q&A portion of the day. So for the next hour, we are going to have an open Q&A. The chat is now open. Please submit your questions and we will address them with Dave as they come in. In order to bridge the time between Dave, your talk on sexual identity and this Q&A, we have one poll.
Oh, great.
We have a poll question for everybody. It's on your screen and you should see a poll window come up here. So this was a poll question that Dave created. Dave, how much do you think that people with IDD's sexual and gender identity is influenced by what they see on TV and talk shows? A, very much influenced. Move this out of the way. B, moderately influenced. C, a little influenced. D, not influenced at all.
Do you get to see the results coming on your end?
Oh, you certainly will. Yes. You don't see them, Dave?
No, I don't see
Not
the
yet.
results. I just see the questions.
You'll see it in just a moment. All right, we have 128 people. We want to hear from everybody, so we'll leave this poll open for a few more seconds. If you're not able to complete the poll, then please feel free to enter into chat. Okay, I think we can close the poll. Do you see the results now, Dave?
I do.
Okay.
May I comment?
Absolutely.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
This was a trick question. Because you notice what it says here. How much do you think that people with IDD sexual or gender identity is fluid, sexual or gender identity? This question was not, how much do you think that people with IDDs sexual behavior is influenced by what they see on TV? Because there's two different answers here. This is about how you are, how you identify, and who you are. And none of that comes from TV. None of that comes from TV. These kinds of the sense of myself as a gay person. I mean, media had nothing to do with that. You have to understand this. This is something that people are born with. This is something that people feel. And watching television, I want you to know, I have seen hours and hours and hours of heterosexual programming. I've seen you kiss, I've seen you court, I don't understand you people. I don't understand your relationships. I don't know that I support mixed marriages like men and women. But I mean, I've seen thousands of hours and never once have I then felt like, God, I so desperately need to kiss a woman. Like, never once, trust me. Now, sexual behavior can be influenced. We had a situation where there was some men who were involved in the sexuality clinic who were all of a sudden engaging in really public, almost sexual assaults. And these are people who had no history of anything like that before. And what we discovered was they were what, well, firstly, a lot of people with disabilities come forward and they ask questions about relationships. Okay, so how do I get a boyfriend? How do I get a girlfriend, and so forth? And most of us just blow that off, you know, and not because we're bad. It's just it's a really hard question to answer. Given the fact that they've asked us over and over and over and over again and haven't gotten an answer, they're going to get an answer somewhere. So television, you know, what we were finding that there was a commercial on television, and what I found interesting, because I travel so much, this didn't play in the States. It played in Canada, Australia, and Europe. And here, I'll tell you, they're simple. So the commercial is, a woman is doing her hygiene in the morning, and just before she leaves, she sprays herself with a perfume called Impulse. And then she leaves her apartment, and us men, being dogs, pick up the scent, you know? And so she's in very public places, like going up an escalator or walking through a subway, and these men are overcome with the scent. So they run off, and in one commercial, a guy buys a dozen roses and runs her down and gives the roses. Now, women, be honest, if you were in a place and some strange guy was running after you with roses, it would scare the hell out of you. But not her. She takes it and she thanks him and so forth. In the other commercial, which was he buys her a box of chocolates and runs up the stairs and hands her a box of chocolates. Now, these two situations aren't really openings for people with disabilities, because number one, I don't know anybody with a disability that could afford roses. And secondly, the chocolate one, I don't know about the people you serve, but the people I serve, what they do is they buy those chocolates, eat those chocolates, and use the energy to run you down. And so what they were doing is seeing a sexual strategy, and that's assault women with kindness. And that's, in every case, that's what they were doing. But this was because in absence of education, in absence of answering questions, people with disabilities will go anywhere. And by the way, that's not just true for people with disabilities. Anybody who isn't given the information necessary will look anywhere that they can for it. So this wasn't about behavior. This was about being. And being isn't influenced by television in the slightest.
Thank you, Dave.
Welcome.
So I was just going to reflect a minute while some questions I think are coming in. A couple of things that kind of stood out to me as you were talking. One is that really stuck with me is that love stories for people with disabilities are often very brutal. That really kind of hit me. And it made me reflect on how, like you were saying, as people get so stuck on the sex part and forget the humanistic part of what we're doing, right? So that really, really stuck out to me. And I think that I'll keep that. And all the things that are put up as barriers to people having real love in their life, and the things that we do as a service system to put barriers up for people.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what? In all my years of doing sexuality work and sex education with people with disabilities, I have never once been asked the question to which the answer was penis goes into vagina. Never once, not once, okay? I get asked, I want a boyfriend. How do I get a boyfriend? I want to fall in love. How do I know if I'm in love? You know, I get asked those kinds of questions. So I never get asked genital questions. I get asked heart questions. And I think that there's a big message in that, that what people with disabilities, they want to feel loved and they want to feel accepted. But what I've noticed is they also have to learn to love themselves and who they are as who they are. You know, and I know that's true for the LGBT community, that all of us have to come to terms with who we are. So we come out to ourselves first before we come out to the world. And we choose where in the world we'll come out and who we feel safe with and so forth. But people with disabilities don't have that kind of luxury. You know, they get whoever's on shift, you know, and they get the attitudes of who's ever on shift. And that's really concerning to me.
And I think with START, one of the tools we use when we begin to work with somebody is to do an eco map of that person. And what we often find is that everybody, or most 99% of the people in that person's life, are paid to be there. You mentioned earlier the use of peer supports, and I wonder if you can comment on how's that been helpful in terms of promoting sexuality and gender identity development and support for people with disabilities.
Well, that situation that I talked about was the very first time that we ever did it clinically. Mm-hmm. However, as an organization, we strongly support self-advocacy. And so we had a self-advocate group running only about 6 months before a very, very, very brave young woman came forward, and she said that she wanted us to start a group for LGBT people, and she wanted Vita to march in the Gay Pride Parade, and she wanted Vita to be with them when we did that. Now, luckily, we have a very forward-thinking board and so forth. So there was no question of doing that. So what we see, and then we found that it was too incestuous because, firstly, there are a minority of people within a minority of people. So there were in Vita there were only like 2 or 3 people who identified that way publicly. So we joined up with 2 other organizations, and we started something called Sprout, which was a group for LGBT people. And so people came from all these different organizations, and they came also from the community as well. And what we've seen there has been absolutely marvelous. And it's not done as a therapeutic thing, it's done as just a service delivery where people get together. But people are really finding their voices. And we found Vita was the very first organization serving people with intellectual disabilities to ever march in a pride parade in the city of Toronto. And so we had, and we invited everybody from Sprout and so forth to come. So we had our big Vita banner, and we were, you will find it. And I was in my power wheelchair at the time, so I was sort of motoring behind, and I was seeing these people whose stories I knew, these LGBT people whose stories I knew, and they shared them with me, and they shared them with me because they knew that I was gay, and they knew that, well, hopefully I would understand. But anyways, we created these cards for them to pass out about the R word and comparing it to the words that are used against the LGBT community. Anyways, they're really nicely designed. And so they were handing these cards out to people. And you should have seen their faces. They were crying, just they couldn't believe where they were. They couldn't believe the celebration. They just had no idea that community existed, and it existed for them. So part of our work is not only creating Sprout as an organization, but connecting it within the LGBT community to other kinds of organizations. Do you know what I mean? And people are really growing and developing and so forth. But the gay community also has to, the LGBT community also has to grow and develop as well, because there's a lot of resistance to diversity within that community anyway. So.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think that linking to other community resources and trying to make that bridge would be an important part of that. As again, from the START perspective, we try to work with systems and the system that surround the person to affect change for that person. And we do run into situations where, for example, a family, because of kind of related to the story you told before, a family for cultural, religious reasons, just says, no, that's not an option for us. That's a sin. We can't allow that. Have you, what strategies have you been successful in working with families or systems that initially have a great deal of opposition to even talking about their gender identity or sexual orientation?
Yeah, that's a very big question. And I wish I brought a whole different set of notes in front of me now, but I'm going to try. Forgive me, I'm going to give a long answer, but I think it's an important question. So when we first began as a clinic, almost immediately people were asking us to do parent training on sexuality. And we didn't do that. Firstly, we were afraid. And secondly, we knew that we didn't know enough. But after a couple of years, we got, okay, we can do this. This is something we can do. So we worked with the other organizations because where I worked, we didn't offer residential services. We just offered behavioral services. So we put out this flyer, sexuality and your child with an intellectual disability. And it went everywhere. I mean, it was in newsletters for organizations. It was well promoted and stuff like that. And people were, oh, this is so exciting. The staff, oh, this is so exciting. We're going to get so many people. This is something parents are concerned about, and so forth. So we rented a gym, and we set up all of these chairs, had 3 urns of coffee, and 2 parents showed up, and they were both weird. What we realized after doing this several times is if you put on a workshop, sexuality in your teens, no parents would show up either. This is an uncomfortable thing for parents. So what we decided to do was we'll speak to their concerns. So now, what are the concerns that parents might have? They're worried about abuse, they're worried about exploitation, they're worried about unwanted pregnancy, they're worried about all those things. So we put out a flyer that says, are you worried about your child's vulnerability to victimization, to exploitation, to unwanted pregnancy, and all that? And I'll tell you, we had a gymnasium full of people showed up to a room that could only hold about 30. We never sent so many people away. And I think it was because we spoke to parents about what their concerns were and let them know we share those concerns. Because I don't know a single person who works in the area of sexuality that isn't concerned about the safety of the people that we provide support for. I mean, that's just a given. And once parents understood that we were standing on the same turf with them and willing to discuss that with them and do some training around that, we got a very different kind of response. Now, that's just to sexuality in general. When it comes to, well, let me tell you, one of the policies that we have at my agency, and I encourage other agencies to have the same policy, because policies sort of take away a lot of discussion, but is we will not break up a consenting relationship between 2 people with disabilities. We will not do that. And there's a reason for that. Because if I asked you all, how many of you would strike a person with a disability, even if the parent, even with parental permission, even if the parent said, this is the only thing that my child understands in terms of discipline, so you need to hit him, you need to spank him, you need to do that thing. How many of you would actually strike someone? I'm willing to bet none of you. Okay. What if a parent said, it's okay to call my child the R word? That's what they are. They might as well get used to it. I'm willing to bet that none of you would call people with disabilities name. So you're saying that I will not physically abuse and I will not verbally abuse people with disabilities. Well, isn't it obvious that using the full weight of agency power to break up a consenting relationship between 2 people is emotional abuse? It is emotional abuse. So we don't abuse people. I mean, that should be a given right from the start. We don't abuse people. You can yell at us. You can call the government about us. You can do anything that you want, but we will not abuse people in our care. And I think that that's a really strong stance to take. And when somebody comes forward, we're not going to abuse your child. You can batter us, you can yell at us, you can do all those things that you have in your power, but ultimately this service stands on the belief that we don't hurt people. Now, people have said, well, they'll take their kids out of care. Well, we've never had anybody actually take their kid out of care. We've had people very angry, but not actually take the kid out of care because their placement is it's very difficult to get placements. But I think that some of this has to be our responsibility. What is it Where is the line that we draw? And to me, the line is abuse. And again, that can be oppositional, but sometimes I think if you're going to work in the area of sexuality and disability at all, you have to discover something. Could you all who are watching or listening just reach around and touch the center of your back? Go ahead. Oh, I see some of you doing. You know what you've got? There's a spine. There's a spine. It needs to be used. You know, I think we cower too much in the face of things. And here's the thing: when we refer to this to families as abuse, you know, there's that word explodes. You know, because families don't want to see themselves as being abusers and so forth. But what they're asking us to do is to hurt their child. You know, and we don't do that, and we take a strong stance on that. But again, now remember, I'm giving you Canadian answers. No, and it's true. It's true. Very few people with disabilities have legal guardians in Canada. Very few. So we're standing even on stronger grounds, you know, because the person with disability who's identifying themselves is more than likely to be their own guardian.
Well, and I think that goes back to another quote I'll just reiterate. You said earlier, our first job is to protect people with disabilities from our own power. So
yes.
That Joni had texted me during when you were talking. I was like, that should be the beginning of every interaction, every service we do is that's the key point.
It is, and recognizing the power that we do have. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes.
And one other thing we have to recognize, David, and that's the courage that they have in trusting us. It takes bravery for somebody to even approach us in that way, and to be respectful and sensitive to that courage and not abuse it, you know, by doing harm. So.
Absolutely. You know, I tell you, whenever somebody with a disability comes forward to tell me something like this, I just feel so honored, like so honored. That is a testament to my care. That's a testament to the service that I've offered, that they've determined that I'm a safe person to tell this big secret to. That's, I mean, no congratulations from anybody, no plaque given by any organization is ever going to feel the same way as somebody who sees me as somebody who's safe. You know, I think that's such a big deal. And I think it's really important that in those moments, that you realize they chose you. Mm-hmm. They chose you. So that's saying, I believe you will help me. I believe you will support me. I believe you'll be on my side. I believe those things. And I don't know that people necessarily think of that. I think often they just simply panic. But no, in that moment, it's such a big, big deal. And for people to realize the honor that's been handed to them in their lives.
That was an earlier, one of the first stories you told about the person asking to talk to somebody other than you, and them talking.
You know, that hurt. I have to tell you, that hurt, yeah. You know, because I thought he would just come to me because he knew that I was gay. I've been open for like over 20 years. Yeah. And no, and you see, it's like when you're working with somebody who's been victimized, and they don't tell you, because they see you having lunch with the supervisor that abused them, or they see you sitting down and chatting about your kids with somebody who, you know what I mean? So yeah. Then how do I know you're safe when I see you so enmeshed in the system? And I never saw myself as being somebody enmeshed in the system, but that's arrogance. Mm. I am not different than the system. I have to let people know who I am. That's my job.
Thanks. I also really liked, I'm gonna turn to Beth in just a minute for some questions from the chat, but I also really liked when you turned around the concept of boundaries. We hear that a lot, like when you're working and people talk about boundaries, referring to the people that we're supporting, right? The people with disabilities don't have good boundaries. And I really like the way you turned it around to say, it's us that don't have good boundaries sometimes when we're interacting and expressing our opinion instead of listening.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that I've been having fun with, I do all sorts of training for people with intellectual disabilities themselves, and they're structured very differently than this kind of thing. But the oh gosh, I'm almost 70, and it just leapt on my head. What? Tell me what we were talking about again. Cue me.
So I was talking about boundaries and how you turned that around for folks.
Yes, yeah, boundaries. We always notice when they violate our boundaries and never notice when we violate theirs. Just never notice that. But one of the things that I do in this training is I get the audience to stand up, and half of them are facing each other, and they're like, my space, your space, my space, your space, and so forth, to get them to understand that that belongs to them. That belongs to them. But one of the things that I'm teaching, and this is fun, and it feels almost like, I don't know, being a little underhanded here, but I teach them that there's a difference between fact and opinion. Mm-hmm. You know, and so we work at defining what those things are, and that most of what staff will give you is what they consider fact, but it's just their opinion. Mm-hmm. You know, and we've had some people go back from trainings and really upset their staff. But I mean, we do tell the staff we're going to do this kind of thing in training, but you know, it's amazing. They'll send people off to training on rights and then be really upset that they come home talking about rights.
Exactly. Yeah. So Beth, I think there have been some comments and questions to come in through the chat. Oh, we can't hear you, Beth.
Yes, there have. Dave, I want to start by letting you know that there has been an outpouring of appreciation for your presentation today. Lots of people saying that you are an amazing speaker. It was a beautiful presentation. And there's one individual in particular who, it's more of a comment, but I wanted to share this and ask what you think and have to say about this. This person said, you're an amazing speaker and your stories have really hit home with me and my best practices for my clinical work. However, as a non-binary person, I feel excluded by some of the language you are using.
Oh, well, I apologize for that. And we had a conversation just before I was about to give this presentation. And I said that I was worried about this presentation because the LGBT community is so broad that I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to cover all of that, and I was aware of that, and I'm particularly aware that, you know, I'm a white male, I'm cisgendered, I am in a wheelchair, but so I don't have the breadth of experiences and life experiences to put on, so I don't want to speak for anybody. But if I use terminology in my presentation that was that you felt that was offensive, I really want you to tell me. I really want you to tell me, because that would help me in my presentation. You know, I had an experience once. I have two little girls who are in my life. Their names are Ruby and Sadie, and both my husband and I, we held them just after they were born, and we've been in their lives for their whole life. And we love these kids without question. And I did a presentation down in the United States, and I used a line, and to be honest, I used the line just for a laugh, and it contained the B word for women. And a woman came up to me and she asked me how I would feel the first time Ruby or Sadie would be addressed in that manner. And I said, I would be really angry. And she said, well, why are you making it easier for people to do it? And you know what? Since that day, I pledged that I would never use that word again. You know, and it's hard not to. It's everywhere. You know, I never realized how much it's in the culture, but I've never personally used it again in a presentation. I've never used it in conversation, and I correct people who use it around me, particularly men when they use it around me, because I now really don't like that word. And the reason I don't like that word is I love those kids, but I also need to love and respect the women who are around me, you know, with the language that I use. So if you could be, I don't know if there's a way that you can get that to me, but I would be very responsive to it.
Thank you, Dave. There's another question in the chat from Christine. When working with a 19-year-old individual who was born male, has IDD, and a significant history of abuse that has talked about wanting breasts since he was 13 to transition, how much influence, if any, should you use to keep the process of transitioning at a slow pace, just in case the individual doesn't fully understand the permanent changes treatment may cause to their body?
Well, the person's been asking this since 13 and they're 19 now. That's a pretty slow pace. So I worry that we worry about causes. Now, to probably overshare here, I was a victim of child sexual abuse by my mother. And what I find is that when I tell people that, they automatically leap to, oh, that's why you're gay. And that offends me just to the core of my being. How could you attribute what I consider one of the most wonderful aspects of how I've lived my life, and one of the most wonderful, I've been married to the same guy for 52 years. And I can't imagine anything other than that. How could you attribute that to something so ugly? So I really worry that we need to stop doing that, you know, making attributions regarding people's past and their identity and so forth. We need to be very cautious because to a certain degree, we need to believe people when they speak to us. Now, I don't know this individual, and I don't know if they've gone through a period of wavering back and forth, or if they have consistently since 13 to 19 made this a statement. And I figure after 6 years of making the statement, people should now be told. Do you know what I mean? And assistance should be provided. That's just my opinion, but it's like non-disabled people get to come out once, and disabled people have to come out over and over and over and over and over again before people believe them. So,
Thank you. So yesterday we also had an orientation session. We talked about cultural identities and culture and bias, and we talked a lot about the fact that people with disabilities have multiple identities.
yes, of course.
Identity as a person with disability, or identity as an LGBTQ person. So how can we best respect those multiple identities working within the service system?
Yeah, it's like people with disabilities, like all the rest of us, stand at all sorts of intersections. You know, I happen to stand on the intersection of disability and sexuality, and I've often not ever been allowed to march in the parade because there's no curb cuts. So I think the way I've always approached it is how does the person identify? What is their hierarchy of identification? And that can switch over time and with different people. But when you're with me, you know, how do you want me to respect your identities? Like, I don't want to focus in on the fact that somebody is LGBT when their primary issue is that they're a person of color. Do you know what I mean? So, sorry?
I think that was unintentional interference, please.
Oh, okay, sorry. So I think we need to be really careful that we don't determine which identity is at the forefront of any given interaction. You know, that the person can bring forward any part of their identity and be addressed and respected with that identity. Does that make sense? Because I know when I present with some people, the issue of my sexuality is at the forefront, and with other people, the issue of my disability is at the forefront, and with other people, I have other identities as well. So.
Yes,
These are hard questions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Can I say something about?
Uh-huh.
So the other identity that the people we support is having mental illness. So what happens is there's this sort of, you know, like going back to the old Steve Reese diagnostic overshadowing. People choose the identity they feel they're most comfortable with, relating to, whether it be your disability as the thing that sort of stands out, and then they attribute it your sexual choice or your identity, your sexual identity, or your anything to that your disability. So how do you get people to think about people in terms of the intersection of who they are? How do you associate that, Dave? What do you do to sort of model the way to that when you're talking with someone?
Well, I think diagnostic overshadowing is one of the large, I mean, that was discovered and talked about in a medical sort of sense, but I think diagnostic overshadowing is epidemic in the service system. You know, I think diagnostic overshadowing leads to people having the what is the word? People not being allowed to achieve potential, people setting very, very low expectations, low to no expectations, because this is what the disability is. And I think it hurts people in all sorts of different ways. So I personally have never, I don't believe that I do that. But I have to be intentional about it. And that's part of what I think we need to do to serve people well is we have to learn to serve people with intention, that we're actively thinking about what we're doing, that I'm intentionally listening, I'm intentionally being kind, because I think we need to realize that, for example, being kind or being compassionate is a personality trait, and it's not. It's a series of decisions. You know, you choose in any given moment to be kind, you choose in any given moment to be compassionate, you make that choice. This choice is not made for you by birth. It's made for you by the interactions that you have. And I understand that in any moment I can choose to be kind or I can choose to be cruel. In any moment I can make that choice. In any moment I can choose to be compassionate or I can choose to be destructive. I can make that choice. And so in my work, and certainly in the training that I do with the staff who work with me, it's like we need to be intentional in every interaction with somebody with a disability, and even with the staff as well, because I don't, I'm somebody who can be really short-tempered, and I can be somebody who says really nasty things really quickly, but I don't. Only because firstly, I got yelled at a lot in the early years of our relationship, but also I learned to be intentional in what it was that I did. And I think that's the only way through.
So Dave, you several times have said about your openness and identifying yourself as a gay man and being very open about that. Have you ever run into situations where then people make an assumption that you're biased or that you shouldn't be talking to them about this because you come to this from a different perspective?
Oh, yes. Oh, all the time. All the time. You're going to be biased. You're going to be reading the situation from a different perspective. You know what? Shut up. I mean, just shut up. You know why? Because I hear heterosexuals speaking about this shit all the time, and nobody says to them, oh, well, you're heterosexual. Do you think you're going to be biased? No, because you're all pure. So
Okay,
no.
all right, chill out. We're gonna have to mute you. You used a 4-letter word.
Oh,
Dave.
I apologize.
Okay, all right, Dave.
Okay, sorry.
All right, take a breath. She was just asking a question.
Well, I wasn't yelling at her. I like her. Yeah, I have to. I mean, I do. I am kind of known as a plain speaker, and I do try to be careful with swearing. But there are some words that I don't think are swear words that other people apparently do.
I think you share that with Joni. She has the same concept, I think. So there is another question that's come in. Says that other people have asked about supporting and advocating for individuals' sexual and gender identity expression while also recognizing the concern for safety while being open about these things. Can you touch on that within the context of maybe internalized bias from some of the clinicians?
Well, and can I just add one element to this, Dave? So there are parts of California in Hollywood and that where there are people where people hang out who are very open and free sexually and in terms of the way they express their identity. And there are individuals with IDD who go to these areas and are easily exploited. And it's very hard because while they feel comfortable there, because they feel open and they feel people are open to them, there is concern that they're being exploited. And it creates this real problem in terms of how you see this, how you support them for some of the people who they're case managers. So I'm wondering if you've dealt with that before.
Yes, and one of the things that I did a very long time ago, because the work that I do falls under the disability informed therapy. And when we do sex education for people with disabilities, we teach people with disabilities that they're easily exploited. We bring it up and we talk about it. I mean, I have seen so many curriculums regarding sexuality for people with disabilities that never mention disability, that never mention manipulation, that never mention that the kind of social exploitation that you're talking about. So we work at teaching people with disability skills and strategies for when they're in those situations, for how to judge whether or not they're safe or what strategies they can use to get out. One of the major strategies that people with disabilities need to learn is simply to buy time. When they're feeling pressure, how do you buy time? We all have that skill in abundance, but a lot of people with disabilities simply haven't been taught these skills. And this is one of the things that worry me. We send people with disabilities out into the world, and LGBT or not, out into the world without the skills necessary to deal with a world that is inherently hostile to them and will exploit them. You know, we had a woman with Down syndrome who would go out shopping and come home with no money because all the clerks and so forth were shortchanging her. I mean, it's not the same thing as you're talking about, but it is the same thing that you're talking about. This is something that happens to disabled people, and with her, she was taught a really interesting strategy, and I got to see her use it. She was in a lineup in a store, and I was off to the side watching. And when she got up to the clerk and handed the money over, when the clerk gave the money back, she said, "Please count my money out because people steal from me." And I want you to know it disappeared. Like people, and she automatically had all the people in the lineup behind her just going like, "You making sure that she wasn't being cheated." That's a brilliant strategy. You know, I wish it was mine. It wasn't. But that's the kind of thing that we need to be looking at in our education for people with disabilities, is to understand that there are a group of people that are seen to be easily manipulated and easily tricked, so that they need some strategies. We had a fellow who wanted to go to the gay bathhouse in New York City, and all sorts of training was done with him about condoms and about condom use and about all those kinds of things, in order to just simply keep him safe. Well, he turns up HIV positive, and the agency's really upset because they took a risk with allowing him to do this and so forth. But when it came in, I had just said to them, it's really a big thing. Get him to tell you the story before you say anything. You know, so they asked him about going down to the bathhouse, and it turned out the first time he went down there, he met his boyfriend, and he never cruised for sex. He never had sex with anybody else. He just had sex with his boyfriend. So he wasn't having multiple partners. It was just his boyfriend. Now, this boyfriend never took him to a movie, never took him out for dinner. They never did anything social together. It was all sexual and all in the bathhouse. So I think it's exploitation, but who cares what I think? He thinks it's his boyfriend. So they said, "Well, did you remember to use the condom?" And they held up a condom, and he laughed. And he said, "Oh, my boyfriend says you don't have to use those anymore because now there's spray-on condoms." So what he had done was use vegetable spray and sprayed it on himself and said it was a spray-on condom, and then infected this guy with HIV. Now, if that surprises you, that surprises me, you know, because what they taught him was about condoms, but they didn't teach him about exploitation. They didn't teach him that people may manipulate him, that there are certain dangers that are very unique to being disabled and being in the community and in very specific places that are regarding sexuality. So we don't teach people those kinds of survival skills that we all have. Like, I know that I could be accused for being sexist here, but when your kids grew up, I'm willing to bet that you saw dangers for your daughters and dangers for your son as very different things, and you taught very different things. Well, why wouldn't we teach very different things to somebody with a disability? Do you know what I mean? So that's been part of our strategy, but we've also, when we face those kinds of issues, we want to make sure we can demonstrate that the person has the knowledge necessary to be in that situation. So we'll come up with our pre-test, come up with our post-test. We'll test for the skills that we're looking for. If they pass that, we're good. We have documentation. We often get that documentation double checked, but nonetheless, we show that we did do caution and concern, because that's our job. Our job is to teach people with disabilities to be in places that they want to be in. And once they're in those situations, it's kind of like, it's up to them now. You've got the knowledge, you know, you need to use it. So
Well, and I think that brings up that point about the power differential, but information is power. So we can't give all the information. In order for them to have the power, they have to have the information, right? So I think we often hoard that as the protector, you're right, and not sharing that. So just thinking about that in terms of just basic sex education. And like you said too, then kind of that brings up the point of, for people who have a disability or are LGBTQIA, that it may need to be altered or different, right? So we've got to think about who our audience is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, to date, I don't know any other organization. We have a class on self-esteem for people with intellectual disabilities. And in there, we introduced the concept of disability pride and disability voice. And it's been amazing. And through that venue of talking about self-esteem, that's where we introduce strategies, strategies for when you're feeling pressured, and strategy when you're feeling disrespected, and strategies when you're acting out of loneliness, like those kinds of things. But I don't find organizations don't even like to talk about disability very much. So to actually talk about the lived experience of people with disabilities in the community is something that many people are very wary of bringing up with someone with a disability. And I don't understand why. We're a disability service system, it shouldn't scare us.
Right.
And by the way, we also went to the Disability Bride March in Chicago once. I don't know if any of the listeners are anywhere near Chicago, but it was an amazing experience, because we want, as an organization, we're sex positive, but we're also disability positive. So we're not afraid to use the word, and we're not afraid to identify ourselves as a service system serving people with intellectual disabilities. So.
Beth, have there been any other questions or comments come through the chat?
Yeah, we got 6 minutes to break.
That's right. There have been a couple of comments that I'll read. One from Lisa, who was agreeing, yes, the explicit and implicit effects of compliance in terms of response makes it even harder for the person with IDD to feel okay about challenging people who lead them.
Yeah, the over-compliance. There was a study done, this is years and years and years ago, Joan, back when you and I were very young. I read a study about compliance for people with disabilities, and what they looked at a comparison between people who are at home with their family, and so what percentage of times do you comply to requests made of you by your spouse or by your kids and so forth. And it was something like 51 or 52% of the time you responded, and the rest of the time you just didn't bother. But for somebody with an intellectual disability, they had to respond to 97% of the commands given towards them, or they were considered a behavior problem for 3% non-compliance. So that, I think, immediately tells you something about what it is that we want to do. And I admit the work that I am the most ashamed of in my history in working in problem behavior is compliance training. Mm-hmm. We did compliance training with everybody. And what its goal was that people would do what we said within a certain number of minutes. And we would even time it, for God's sakes. We did bad stuff,
Yeah, I think that's something we run into as START teams too, that there's this expectation of compliance. And so the problem that people are presenting with is non-compliance, which is just doing what all of us do. Like you just said, most of us don't comply with whatever people ask us to do.
And we have a higher compliance rate at work than we do at home. And that makes sense,
Well, my entire team is only at 51% compliance, Dave. You're doing that day.
Not a good day.
No, it's not. No.
So we also had another comment from Shamar on the topic of information hoarding. Systems can hoard information to prevent people from understanding their options or realizing their freedom. That's unjust and can also be dangerous. And I'd like to add to that Joni had contributed and said, teaching is not condoning. It's not about condoning, it's about supporting. And she also added that all of these factors that we're discussing contribute to a sense of well-being and to PERMA, which is a topic that we will explore a little bit more in our panel discussion later this afternoon.
Yeah, yeah.
So information is power.
So I have something now that we only have 5 minutes. You know, people don't like talking about sex, Dave. That's why they don't want people to have sex, because they don't want to talk about it and they don't want to think that anybody has sex. They don't even want to discuss that they have sex. And I'm wondering, and I remember years ago, you would just talk about sex to get everybody to stop doing that. And I was wondering when we're training clinicians across the country, what do you recommend? Do you recommend that we address this sexual expression as part of the actual training in our discussion with teams? Should we assume those days are over? Everybody's into sex now? Like, where are we in 2020 with regard to the dialogue about sex and sexuality?
Well, to a certain degree, it depends on where you are. I think that's a geographical question, because where I live in Ontario, people are much more likely to be able to talk about these things and joke about these things. But you go a couple provinces over to Alberta, and you have people who are really conservative who would never say it. I was about to use another bad word, so I'm so glad I caught myself. But so I think it's a geographical issue. I mean, even when I speak to audiences, I always speak to the organizers first and say, what's the culture here regarding language? You know, because I don't want to use language that builds a barrier for people to hear me because I used a particular word. So when you go from place to place with that, but the issue is, we're not ever asking them to talk about their sexuality. And any training program that does, I think it needs to be very much investigated, because it's not appropriate. It's not appropriate to talk about any of the staff's sexual life or any of that kind of stuff. We're talking about this from the point of view of understanding somebody else's sexuality and our responses to it. It's really not so much about sex as it is about, okay, who are you and how will you be in relationship to somebody who tells you or speaks to you. We had to do the same thing with abuse, believe it or not, you know, is that we had to train people. We never talked to any of our staff about their own history of abuse, but we do recognize that that it's a topic that's sensitive because a lot of people have been hurt. But the issue is, it's not you here right now. It's how are you going to be in reaction to and response to somebody who gives you this information? You know, how are you going to manage you? And what kind of message do you want your behavior to give to the person that you're speaking to? Because one of the things that I think about often is that people with disabilities really are at the blunt end of our service. Do you know what I mean? And we have to work really, really, really hard that to soften the blows a little bit, you know, to make sure that we're not part of that problem. It terrifies me that somebody would come out to a staff or clinician and have that reaction, even if it's just shock, lead to them never telling anybody again. And one of the things I've been teaching our staff too is when people feel when people feel frustrated, just frustrated over some situation or whatever, frustration always looks like on your face like anger. Mm-hmm. So you need to be telling people with disabilities how it is you're feeling, because they need to know that, especially if you're being shocked. Oh, I'm really, really surprised, or that really makes me angry for you, or oh, that really, really frustrates me. Because if you don't say that, they're going to see the look on your face and think that they're in trouble. So, and I think do that with your kids too. I'm willing to bet that your kids think that you're mad at them all the time, when in fact that you're rarely mad at them, that you're more often frustrated. And there's a big difference between mom and dad are mad at me all the time and mom and dad are frustrated with me because they love me so much. Do you know what I mean? There's big differences in those messages. So I think we need to be very clear if we're having that kind of reaction to state it.
And I think that comes back around to the focus of this in terms of emotional well-being. And like you said, most of the time people aren't actually asking about the act of sex. They're asking about relationships.
Yes.
And their feelings. And I think that part for us is to be aware and to make it safe for people to say who they have had in their life, who has been an intimate relationship for them, who do they love, who do they care about. And I think I would go back to right at the beginning, that to remember that we're kind of standing on sacred ground, and that we need to give that opening opportunity for people to feel safe enough to share that with us, and for us to acknowledge, like Joni said, how much courage and bravery that takes when they are part of a system that's not always treated them the way they should be treated.
Yeah, yeah.